The following program contains the use of racial epithets in historical context and to recount personal experiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Stewardesses were glamorous. They were beautiful. They were poised. It just looked like the world was theirs, and I wanted that life.
I just can't wait to see all the places I've heard so much about. Paris, Rome, Bangkok, Buenos Aires.
How many small-town girls like me looked at a flight attendant and thought, that's the best job in the world?
Rosemary, I'd like to talk to you about your coffee service. You've been pouring from too high.
No other job offered as much freedom with such a high cost of conformity.
We were not expected to have opinions. We were to serve and look glamorous.
Where is the stewardess where a woman wants a Nowhere. Busy with the men. Coffee, tea, or what you will. Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, how about some coffee? And make it hot.
Selling sex instead of safety.
Oh, excuse us.
Remember what it was like before there was somebody else up there who loved you? Remember?
I hated that.
Airlines hired these women who were independent and curious, and it's amazing to me that airlines would expect that they would be a docile group, because why would they be?
TWA has been shut down for more than a month by a strike of stewards and stewardesses.
I don't think we realized what a revolutionary thing we were doing.
Stewardesses played a major role in launching the women's movement.
They took up economic issues, but they also focused on issues having to do with appearance, grooming, and control over women's bodies.
How did these women go from conforming to gender stereotypes to fighting for gender equality in the workforce?
I was a TWA flight attendant, but I was an activist in the change. I was there.
At Liberty Mutual, we believe progress happens when people feel secure. That's why we exist, to help people embrace today and pursue tomorrow.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud sponsor of American Experience.
As an American-based supplier to the construction industry, Carlisle is committed to developing a diverse workplace that supports our employees' advancement into the next generation of leaders, from the manufacturing floor to the front office. Learn more at carlisle.com.
One of my best friends, she had a brother who bought this Corvette. We would be out on the road, and he should say, well, where do you want to go? And I would say, let's go to the airport.
When I was in high school, I convinced my friend Nancy that we should go on a trip when our junior year ended. And that June, off we went. I shopped for a week for the outfit I was going to wear on the flight.
My first flight, I was about 8 or 9. We were all dressed up, socks with the little lace all around the edges of it. I thought, this is just like Easter. I'd been on boats before, and I thought, well, this was going to be similar to a boat. When we started to roll, oh, this is more like a roller coaster.
I remember the takeoff. I remember playing with the air. You know, I had my own little vent, gently putting a breeze on my face. I couldn't believe when they gave me food. They put my breakfast down, and it was delicious. Scrambled eggs and those little sausages and a fruit plate. And I just was dazzled from the minute I stepped on that plane.
I thought, oh, this has to be what heaven feels like. I've got to be close to heaven. It was the most beautiful thing I had experienced, just being in the air.
So many of our advances as humans come from travel. It is an incredibly human impulse, and yet it was really restricted for women until the 20th century. These new technologies came around, enabling humans to move around, and women really wanted to be a part of it.
Ellen Church was a registered nurse, but she got her pilot's license. She knew that aviation was the future.
But because airlines refused to countenance that a woman could be a pilot, Ellen's idea was, all right, if they're not going to let me be a pilot, at least maybe they'd let me be a flight attendant.
In the late 1920s, you see an experimental era where some airlines are trying out different models of cabin service. The most obvious model would be Pullman porters.
But there's a long-standing association between technological know-how and white supremacy. And they do not think that Black people have the kind of authority to kind of help people through the challenges of flying.
So the airlines thought, we probably want white men because this might be a position where you would get promoted into management.
Ellen Church went to San Francisco to the office of what would later become United Airlines. Then she went to an executive and she said, I think if there were nurses on airplanes, more people would fly. You're trying to attract passengers, but people think it's dangerous, people get sick. A nurse would be a calming person and we'd be able to take care of passengers. Planes weren't pressurized, so they flew under 10,000 feet. And that means you feel every bump. It was always turbulent.
There were no circulation systems, so you could smell hot oil and the disinfectant used to clean up after airsick passengers. To go from coast to coast, it took 28 hours at minimum. Often planes would get grounded in the middle of nowhere. passengers would have to wait for several days until the weather cleared. It was really a big adventure instead of a reliable way to travel.
It was a harrowing thing to fly. You couldn't get a life insurance policy to cover you if you flew on airplanes, because the death rate was something that no one wanted to insure.
The idea is that if you're encouraging people to fly, especially men, at a moment when flying can seem very scary, if you put young white women on an airplane, then they're going to think, well, if these young white women are fine with flying, I should be fine with flying too.
Ellen Church was convinced that women would want to do this, and she was absolutely accurate. They showed up in huge numbers.
The focus on only hiring women had a lot of advantages, the airline executives thought.
The airlines started to realize the passengers were more attracted to having a woman do the job for the charm that she brought, the attractiveness that she brought to an otherwise exceptionally unpleasant experience.
During World War II, women had worked in all kinds of non-traditional jobs. When the soldiers and sailors came home, there was a concerted effort to push women out of the workplace.
March of the troops, masses of manpower.
Women who were poor or women of color ended up going back to lower paying jobs. For middle-class women were expected to go home.
Margaret, I'm home.
We're in the kitchen. Growing up in the 1950s, it was very clear to me what women's roles were supposed to be.
The American home. Today, it is perhaps the most important job in the world.
It was reflected in television, it was reflected in the books I read, it was reflected in the examples used in my school lessons.
Father knows best.
I absorbed that. I didn't question it at all. It was just the way things were.
As a child, I used to dream of being a nurse. And then, of course, I wanted to be a mother. We were a happy family. So I thought, oh, that would be a nice thing to do. Have children and have a husband and the picket fence and all that type of thing.
There were all kinds of different expectations for men and women. They were basically considered two different types of human beings. Men were supposed to be the leaders, the presidents, the newspaper reporters, people who took dangerous jobs, people who took important jobs. Women were expected to get married and raise a family. But before that, it was expected that they would work at a number of lower-level jobs: secretary, clerk, librarian, teacher. They were not expected to have careers. My parents were opposed to my going to college. Their expectations for me were to get married and have a family. They felt that the fact that I had been a good student was already going to make it harder for me to find a husband.
Is it that late? Dad will be here any minute. Better tell Mother she's needed in the kitchen. Brother is spending an hour before dinner catching up on his homework.
My parents could only afford to send one child to college, and that was my brother.
Now, mother and daughter put the finishing touches on the dinner.
That was the way parents thought at the time. My brother would go to college. I would go to secretarial school, get married, and produce grandchildren.
After World War II, the airline industry introduced the DC-6 with a pressurized cabin, so airplanes could now fly higher, smoother, faster, and also carry more passengers.
The customer who's sitting in the seats is going to experience flying as pretty comfortable. You have plush seats.
Like some dinner, sir?
Then you're going to be served cocktails.
How about you, hon? Oh, this looks delicious.
They were marketing comfort, which meant you don't need a nurse. This is the moment when this profession becomes heavily, heavily identified with women and almost exclusively populated by women.
I remember in 7th grade, I read this book, How to Become an Airline Stewardess. And the first line was, would you like a boyfriend in every city in the world? And I was like, yes, I would. But I also was like, I want to go to every city in the world.
Being a stewardess was the best possible job for good girls who were craving something interesting, out of the ordinary. The woman could go to different places and see different things and really stand out. But at the same time, she was doing something that was still very stereotypically feminine.
If you were applying to be a stewardess, you were going to be scrutinized first and foremost for your looks.
To qualify on most airlines, she must be healthy and of normal weight.
You got this chart, and you wouldn't even get an interview if your height and weight was more than listed on that chart.
If you make it physically, then what they're looking for is someone who's going to take orders well. They need pliant employees.
The educational requirements for stewardesses really varied very much by airline. On Pan Am, you had to have gone to college and you had to speak 2 languages fluently.
My dream flight attendant job was with Pan Am or TWA. And I was as good as hired with Pan Am, but I flunked the French test with TWA. I'd made it through that grueling interview process. And when I got the acceptance letter, it was beyond exciting. They flew us to Kansas City for 6 weeks. I arrived in January, freezing cold, snow up to here, the happiest girl in the world.
The training was held in Miami, and the 6 weeks involved learning the procedures for services. How do you make coffee on the airplane? How do you work the ovens? How did you mix drinks? Where did you mix them? How did you pass them out?
There were segments on understanding the physics of flight.
Should there be a sudden loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will be released automatically.
There were segments on safety.
You fasten them tightly, and I'm going to show you the braking position.
Part of our safety training was on mock-up planes. They had recordings of people screaming. They could put smoke coming through. So they could really make you feel like you were in a plane crash.
You have to be able to evacuate any aircraft within 90 seconds.
The airline knew that for a huge number of their passengers, this would be their first flight. They would be in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, and any fear that they felt was very justified, and so they wanted stewardesses to be very knowledgeable and specific in their ability to reassure a passenger.
Chins up, stand up straight. Very good. That's fine.
When women were first hired on airplanes, the sales pitch around them was that having a mere girl willing to fly would help sell tickets. By the 50s, the pitch had flipped. Prices were fixed by the government. The airlines had to compete based on image and perks.
Airlines want to portray a vision of luxury and domesticity. Flight attendants really become the linchpin to that as hostesses.
They wanted someone who was stereotypically very beautiful. That was a way for an airline to distinguish itself and appeal to a largely masculine customer base.
The airlines really wanted a visual standardization of what a lovely stewardess looked like.
We all got our hair cut just the length of our chin bone. We were all supposed to look the same. Both our hair, but also our makeup. Red lipstick, mandatory. There was an idea, I think, to make us into little machine parts and not think of ourselves as individuals.
In our graduation photo, we look like 20 mannequins sitting in 2 rows. When I looked at it, I couldn't find myself. That was my first thing was, where am I in this photograph?
The grooming supervisors were former flight attendants. Their whole job was to make sure that your high heels were 3 inches tall, that you had white gloves that were white, no runs in your stockings. Your shoes were polished, not just the right heel height.
They'd look you over and gal would do like this to your buttocks to see if you had your girdle on.
They had this big piece of paper with up here is hair, nails. You couldn't be too flashy.
You really need to have a good understanding of middle-class deportment, speech, manners, poise, as the airlines would put it.
They told us they wouldn't hesitate to kick us out of that class if we didn't do the right things.
Now a few cigarettes, sir.
Oh, no thanks, I have a fine cigar.
Well, may I put it out for you then, sir?
Put it out, I just lit it.
Some of the passengers get a little, well, you know how it is with people who don't smoke cigars.
Oh, no.
And the right things included always being friendly to everyone.
You see, you can handle just about any situation if you'll just smile and really mean it inside.
It's expected, it's part of the job to act like your smile is genuine and everything you're doing is because you like being a gracious hostess.
If they didn't care for something you did or said or reacted to, they would wait until everyone was in class and they'd tap you on your shoulder and they took you to your room, packed your bags, and they sent you home.
The astonishing jet at last comes into its own in 1959. New York to Paris, 7 hours. Here's America's Boeing 707.
all of a sudden you could be in Paris. You didn't take a ship that took weeks and weeks. It was hours.
Jets were really symbolic of technological advance. This was a sign that Americans were going to be able to take over the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are now at cruising altitude, 35,000 feet.
Now you've got a jet that can travel 2 times faster than propeller and can accommodate more people. So this is imperative for the airline to start expanding their customer base because they now have more seats to fill. They start to cater not just exclusively to the business traveler. They start to go, well, what about bringing your wife? What about bringing your kid?
This is the moment where flying is becoming mass transportation. That's the vision.
This is your captain again. If you haven't already changed your watches to conform to the time difference, I suggest you do so now.
The jet age is technological, but it's also aspirational. It's a yearning on the part of ordinary Americans to participate in the glamorous lives of celebrities. So a factory worker celebrating retirement after 30 years on the job, you could be like Sinatra and fly down to Peru and have a glamorous vacation.
Stewardesses are at the center of jet age ad campaigns. This is a new type of woman. She's sophisticated. She's very fashionable. Airlines rolled out new uniforms. They call it the jet age look.
You see a crew walking in their powder blue uniforms with their pillbox hats and their high heels. And it was quite a sight to see. I mean, it was the definition of glamour.
Oh, you're a stewardess? You were just on the same level as a celebrity movie star. It opened the doors to everything. Clubs, parties. You could crash a wedding and say you were a stewardess.
If I wanted to fly with my friend Lynn, and she was junior to me, I could adopt her seniority, and then we both could fly together. Or you could trip trade. If you knew you wanted to go to Paris with your best friend, you would trade to be on that trip. I went to Paris, I went to Rome, I went to Athens. I flew to London and to Frankfurt a lot. There was so much to see and do. You could go to Vidal Sassoon to get your hair cut, and then you could go out for a really nice meal. It really changed me in terms of my palate. I used to go to a favorite restaurant in London so that I could eat the tandoori chicken.
Then when we landed, I was in Mexico City and could go to dinner. Wow. Get back on the airplane and fly into Central America. Oh my gosh, pick up the newspaper from Guatemala and see what's going on there.
I became quite independent. And I felt very comfortable moving around in these foreign cities.
In the 50s and 60s, women very rarely traveled alone. And working on a plane, especially internationally, gave you an excuse to travel completely freely. You were going to these foreign countries and checking into a hotel with your other fellow stewardesses, and then no one knew what you did until you had to show up at the airplane next.
I had grown up in a very narrow, sheltered environment. I went out there and I was confronted with all the things that the world had to offer.
It gave me a lot of self-confidence that I could just get on an airplane and go someplace on my own and be quite happy. That wasn't true of everybody that I went to college with or I went to high school with, that they could do that or wanted to do it, but I wanted to do it, and I did do it.
This job was asking women for their ambitions. It was asking for a woman who wanted to see uncharted terrain, a woman whose curiosity was enormous, which no other feminized job in that era really wanted. It was incredible.
I was kind of looking for something a little different in my life. I was looking at a fashion magazine, and the magazine had an advertisement for the Grace Downs Icarus School in Manhattan. I applied, and I was accepted in 1956. Never had been on an airplane. So this was a part of, I've never been on an airplane. This is great. This is great.
Women could pay the school and learn how to become an airline stewardess. The expectation, if you did well at the school, you would ultimately get hired and get a job as a stewardess.
Now, this is the main cabin door where the passengers for first class will be entering.
I was the only student of color in the school. There were no black teachers, no black students. I remember we had a makeup class, and someone made up my face. I have to laugh now because I was white. And when I looked in the mirror, I'm saying, oh my God, how am I going to get home like this? They had no makeup, of course, for people of color. When you would graduate, then airlines would come to the Grace Downs Icarus School to interview you, to put you into positions in their aircraft. I was interviewed by Mohawk Airlines, by Capital Airlines, which was one of the largest Southern airlines, and TWA. Now, everyone was getting interviewed, and people were getting hired, but I was not even getting a response from any of the instructors or the airlines. Shortly after the interviews, one of the chief stewardesses saw me outside. And she said to me, Pat, I hate to see you go through this. She said, but the airlines do not hire Negroes. The South, it was open, clear, that white people had this advantage, black people had no advantage. I'm in New York. It's not as clear or vivid. Subtle, yes. You just didn't know certain things. And then when the airline situation occurred, it just opened my eyes totally. Yes, it exists here.
Traveling by air was very expensive and not easily accessible to most Americans in general, let alone African Americans. It's not surprising that Pat Banks didn't have a full understanding of what was taking place.
A lot of airports in the 1950s were either segregated or beginning to be segregated. Airlines sometimes used a special code if people called from a black neighborhood or if they sounded black, and a special code would be written down on their ticket to indicate that they had to be seated apart from others.
In some instances, African Americans would be bumped off of flights to make space for white passengers.
I went home and we had a neighbor. And I called him as soon as I got home and I said, "Pop, they're telling me that they don't hire Negroes." He said, "We'll take care of this." He introduced me to Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell referred me and introduced me to the New York State Commission Against Discrimination.
There were no federal laws in place to protect against discrimination in the workplace. So it was very important for Pat to file her case in New York because New York was the first state in the United States to pass an anti-discrimination law.
I filed a case against Mohawk, Capital, and TWA. The statute of limitations had expired with Mohawk and TWA, but it held strong with Capital. Discrimination is a very difficult thing to prove.
Airlines don't specify that they're not going to hire black women, but they don't really need to, because manuals will say things like, "Oh, are your hands soft and white?"
They talk about how people shouldn't have broad or flat noses, people shouldn't have hooked noses, coarse hair, overly full lips, indicating certain kind of racial stereotypes about Jews and blacks. They actually include enough details to make sure that certain kinds of people really cannot get employed.
When I was hired, you couldn't be married, period. We had a couple of gals that did it on the side, but you couldn't be married then, couldn't have children.
From the very beginning, most airlines have an explicit ban on hiring married women. Starting in 1953, American Airlines imposed a new rule that stewardesses will leave the job when they turn 32.
It took a little while, but other airlines started adding the age rule too.
They wanted us to be hired, do our job for a couple of years, and leave.
Airlines wanted women who projected a degree of wholesomeness, but also a little bit of sexual availability. They wanted her to be young so that she would appear to be single without having to say so.
United had flights out of New York to Chicago called executive flights. Only men could buy a ticket on those planes.
When I went for my interview with TWA, I signed a paper which they presented to me, and on it, it said that I would be retired at the age of 35. 35 was a long ways away. I thought I would be married with children. That was the expectation. You would meet Mr. Wonderful in first class, and you'd be swept off your feet, etc., and that would be happiness ever after.
The requirement to be unmarried, the requirement to stay under a certain age. But it's really about making sure that flight attendants are not getting paid top dollar, that they're not going to get a pension, that they're not going to accrue vacation benefits that they would have gotten if they're in year 15 or year 20 of their career.
It was money, money, money. What do you think it costs to have an A stewardess at age 32, top salary, maximum vacation, gonna fly until she's 60, get a retirement? If you're not married and having babies and happy to stay there, tough luck, honey. I didn't want to stop flying. Flying was exciting. God, it was then. It still is, but then it was really exciting.
Flight attendants start to organize in the late 1940s. They're unhappy with their wages, but they're also unhappy with being patronized by the airlines.
Pretty quickly, they began to realize that they would have greater bargaining leverage if they joined with some of the other workers. The pilots set up a division for stewards and stewardesses, and some of the flight attendants went into the Transport Workers Union.
Unions just weren't something I thought of. When I was in training, I failed the section on the contract. I didn't understand it. And I didn't understand it until I started flying, and I realized how the company took advantage of stewardesses.
Being from Pittsburgh, I was quite familiar with unions. And so there would be a union meeting and I would go to it.
The grievance procedure was an orderly settlement of a dispute. I thought, this is interesting. I kind of like that.
Flight attendants, pilots, and baggage handlers wanted to be paid fairly. They wanted more control over their hours, their flight time. But flight attendants also had problems that the men didn't face. When American Airlines said we're going to put it in the contract that flight attendants can't work past the age of 32, the union pushed back. The rule still went in, but what they did win was a compromise, what they called a grandmother clause, so that any flight attendant who had been hired before 1953 could continue on. It saved a lot of jobs. Dusty wasn't required to retire when the age rule came in. She had nothing to lose. She said, I want to fight this. This is wrong. And that was her motivation to join the union.
My family was very Republican. And unions were naughty, naughty, naughty. Terrible. Nobody in my family had ever belonged to a union. That was just, oh my goodness, we're college people. We don't join unions. Oh.
She became vice chair and would file grievances on behalf of other stewardesses. Dusty exuded this sense of confidence. She always spoke to anybody who would speak to her, and many men always did. Because she was so attractive, they wanted to know, who is this woman?
I figured out that the Congress was in session on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And then they went home on Friday. So I bid the Washington trip on Monday. And I'd always have a bunch of congressmen on board. And they got to know me. Dusty, how you doing? I said, oh, I'm really upset about this. My best friend's being fired because she's 32. They said, what? They fire you? Here, these guys are 60.
Dusty, as she's flying, she's working her connections. She's leveraging the visibility of stewardesses to gain access, essentially, to people who can pull levers of power in policymaking circles.
In 1963, Dusty decided to put on a press conference
To say the word stewardess in those days was glamour. Oh boy, oh boy.
She got 4 stewardesses that were under 32 and 4 stewardesses that were over 32.
I said, now they're firing us at age 32. Can you tell me which ones are 32? And of course they said, no, but I did look pretty good.
The idea is basically, hey, take a look at us. Don't we all look like lovely stewardesses? It's a kind of dare to the airline's policy. Can you really tell who's past the age limit?
We hit every newspaper in the country.
These women were really trying to use the sexism that was being wielded against them to get what they wanted, which was to keep their jobs.
When the stewardesses went into negotiation with the union and management, American Airlines came into the room with a stack of newspapers from all over the country and just plopped it down on the desk saying, that was an interesting stunt that you girls pulled. We're not going to negotiate the age rule now.
It's terrible to be fired because of age. But I had hopes because I knew how smart Dusty was.
I believed in fair play. Every club I ever was in, I became president. I was president of the Women's Athletic Council, then president of my sorority. I knew all the rules, and I went by them. And if I didn't like a rule, we changed it.
Dusty wasn't just fighting airline management and an age rule. She was fighting national gender discrimination.
Once things began to hit the newspapers, I would get letters. When I had threatening letters, I had to report it to the police. You kind of expect these things. You knew you were going to get focused on. You knew that you were going to get letters of negativity. I mean, this is something, oh, here it comes. I just couldn't deal with the racism anymore. I couldn't deal with it. I didn't think it was fair. I'm just as equal to you as you are to me. We're one. We're humans. And you're not going to treat us this way anymore.
Pat's plans were put on hold while her lawyers researched her case. They had to look at the supervisor notes and see who met what criteria, how did Pat compare to the other applicants. They were trying to prove that she was the typical all-American girl. She played violin, she was respectable. So the element that excluded her from that image of femininity and Americanness was her race.
I was determined that somebody of African American heritage was going to get this job.
Finally, in late February 1960, Pat got her ruling.
I was working for Con Edison, going to college at night. And there was a little candy store on the corner where I used to get the bus to go home. When I got into the candy store, the man in the store said, Pat, you won the case. I couldn't wait to get home. My mother says, Patsy, the phone is ringing off the hook. You won. Oh my God. The court ordered Capital Airlines to hire me, or it would go to the Supreme Court. The president of Capital Airlines called me. I don't remember his name, but he called to apologize and welcome me into training in Alexandria, Virginia. You know, it was like we did it. They can't get away with this anymore. I'm young now. I like to hang out with friends and do things, but I had to be this perfect human being. And the only way I could do that was to do my job, go home, come back. I wouldn't do anything that may have led to a mistake. I remember we were on a DC-3. And DC-3s are kind of bumpy. This man looked at me and he said, when you finish doing your work, would you please hold my hand? And I said, sure, sir, I'll sit down with you. So he held my hand and he asked me, he said, have you ever been to Montana? I said, no, sir. He said, the grass is so beautifully green, the trees are so green. He said, no niggers and no winos. I'm holding his hand. Now, the word nigger is something you never touch me with. But by the power of God, I was able to sit there and hold his hand and not respond. I mean, I didn't respond until I got home that night. But these are the kind of situations that occurred that you had to really, really keep it together. I worked for a year. I wanted to go on with my life, finish school. I was planning on getting married, so I decided to leave. I felt it was accomplished. The barrier was broken.
Any questions that any company may have had as to whether a Negro was capable of doing the job, Pat set the record straight. We could go above and beyond doing this job.
The floodgates do not open. It really, at that time, is about saving face. It's about letting a few in to avoid more lawsuits. Pat is very much part of a group of activists at the grassroots level who are pushing for changes, certainly at the local level, but even more significantly at the federal level.
Pat's victory with the airlines takes place just as the civil rights movement is really heating up. Changes in the air.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now.
5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson.
The Civil Rights Act was designed to address the race-based inequalities that have been a part of the United States since before the United States was founded. Less known about the Civil Rights Act is that the worker protections to prevent discrimination also covered sex.
Just before it was passed, Howard Smith, a congressman from Virginia, introduced an amendment to include prohibition on gender discrimination. It was then called sex discrimination. This stunned everybody there because this was a law that was supposed to help black people.
What is your opinion, Mr. Chairman, of the current Civil Rights Bill?
Now, we've had trouble with the so-called civil rights thing for a good many years.
His motivations were not clear.
One interpretation is that he did that to add this laughable idea of sex discrimination that would help tank the bill. The other interpretation is that he wanted to ensure if this bill was going to provide all these protections for Black Americans, that white women should get protection as well.
If that's the ugliness of the sausage making, I mean, the sausage isn't that bad, right? Because for the first time in the United States, we now have employment protections that are designed really to promote women entering professions that were otherwise reserved for men.
Our eyes were like, oh, that is gender. That includes gender. Women have rights now.
The passage of the Civil Rights Act was a major step forward. But the passing of a law is not enough. It's nowhere near enough. You comply with the law because you think it's good for the, it's a good way to live. You stop at a red light so people don't crash into each other. Good. But if you pass a law that people don't want to obey, they won't.
The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was set up to be the enforcement mechanism to make sure that discrimination in employment was not happening.
Good morning, this is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. May I help you?
The expectation at the EEOC when they opened their doors was that they were going to hear from a bunch of African Americans who had documented cases where their rights as a worker had been ignored.
I was going to be fired at age 32. Dusty and I went to the EEOC so I could file a complaint. Dusty had heard they were opening that day, so we planned our flight to be there. There were people putting typewriters here and, chairs there and getting it all straightened out. They had just opened the doors. They weren't really ready at all.
We were there the first day. This black woman looked at me, she said, "You're free white and 21, what are you here for? You have everything going for you." So when we said, "Sit down, honey, I got a story to tell you," and we told them. And they went, ooh, they couldn't believe it.
I joined the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission October 4th, 1965, 3 months after the agency opened. I was the first woman attorney in the Office of the General Counsel, which dealt with answering the big legal questions that came up in administering the law. We had tons of complaints filed by the stewardesses.
They had no idea what was coming, this volcanic kind of expression of a yearning for justice of women, keeping it bottled up for so long.
They challenged restrictions on age, the ability to get married, that you couldn't be pregnant and be a flight attendant. They filed complaint after complaint after complaint.
Within a year, flight attendants had more than 100 cases on file.
These were not women who were setting out to break barriers for women. They just wanted to keep their jobs. But the EEOC was not taking these complaints based on gender very seriously.
There were commissioners who were favorable to women's rights, but the executive director was opposed to women's rights, vice chair was opposed, and on the staff level, I was the only woman speaking out. From an early age, I was sensitized to the second-class treatment of blacks in this country. But I was blind to the second-class treatment of women in this country. I had never done anything or given any thought to women's rights, but I read the statute. The law said you have to handle cases of sex discrimination. You don't have a choice when a law says something has to be investigated to say, I don't feel like doing that part of the law.
This book has sold more than 50,000 copies in the hardcover edition, and 700,000 have been published in paperback. Betty Friedan, a trained psychologist turned housewife, mother, and author.
The feminine mystique is the name that I have given to the image of woman that we have been living by in America and, in fact, in most of the Western world for the last 15 or 20 years.
The feminine mystique put words around the disquiet that a lot of women of a certain class were experiencing. It called to people's attention the reality that women who were smart and educated and could do so much were confined to one role once they were married and had children, and that was mom and wife.
Ms. Friedan, do you think maybe society is right now in an age of evolution and of change?
Oh, yes, and I think no one's going to hand women anything. I think women must begin to say yes to themselves and become who they could be and ask for society the real solutions that women still need.
Betty Friedan came to the EEOC because she thought she was going to write a follow-up book to The Feminine Mystique about all the progress she thought women had made. And she saw me there, a woman, so she came over to me and she said, what's really going on here? What's happening? I was feeling pretty down. I had had a discussion with the executive director who was opposed to women's rights. I asked her to come into my office and I leveled with her. I said, what this country needs is an organization to fight for women like the NAACP fights for its members.
Halloween weekend, 1966, 19 women and 2 men met in the basement of the Washington Post to form NOW, the National Organization for Women, which had been conceived in the summer.
All of us wanted women to be accepted in educational institutions on an equal basis. And we wanted women to be treated equally on the job.
Sonia started feeding information to 2 of the other NOW founders about what the EEOC was not doing about women's equality.
Then we would draft a letter from NOW to the EEOC complaining about the EEOC's action in various sectors. I knew that wasn't proper procedure, but I was so emotionally involved that I did it. To my amazement, nobody ever raised the question of how come these people know what the commission is doing at its innermost meetings.
NOW took many directions to try to pressure the EEOC to enforce the law. They used demonstrations. They filed lawsuits. They went into the legislature to say, hey, they aren't enforcing your law.
Ida Phillips is a waitress in Florida. She was refused a job at a defense plant because she had a preschool-aged child. The company felt a child not yet in school would keep Mrs. Phillips home from work too often. She took her case to court, and the Supreme Court has agreed to review it. The Supreme Court is involved because of the 1964 Civil Rights Law.
One of the things the EEOC did was to signal how the courts were going to think about things. A particular concern for the airlines was whether they were going to have to change rules about marriage and age.
In Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, there is mention of a bona fide occupational qualification.
That was a provision in the statute, and what it meant was, for some jobs, you don't have to hire men and women equally. For example, if you were hiring somebody as a wet nurse, you don't have to interview men for that job.
The airlines thought it was absolutely necessary for their business that they have only women. And because they only had women, they really weren't discriminating.
Airlines were very confident that the public liked having stewardesses on planes. They actually did surveys that showed that 80% of the flying public preferred stewardesses over stewards.
They'd push the EEOC to have hearings so they could clarify the situation.
They put on this whole elaborate defense. Men can carry trays, but they can't be charming. And they can't create the liveliness and the atmosphere that young women can create.
And we argue that a man cannot do this in the same capacity whatsoever that a woman can. And therefore, being a woman is essential for the job.
The Employment Opportunities Commission issues its opinion, and it says being female is absolutely not a qualification for this job.
Then they had to issue the second decision, which was, is it a violation of Title VII for airlines to terminate or ground stewardesses at the age of 32 or 35 or when they got married? I drafted the decision of the commission, finding that it was unlawful.
One option for the airlines is to just give up and to change their hiring and firing policies. But if something is so dear to you, then you're going to fight.
I was a doctor's assistant in Washington, D.C.
I did all the bookkeeping, I did all the secretarial work. I met Richard Lansdale. He was an attorney, and I fell in love. I just fell in love with him. He said, "Why don't you get out of what you're doing now and become a stewardess?" I was working 60 hours a week and getting paid for 40 and no vacation, no sick leave. I had no benefits at all. So it seemed like a good thing to do. I went to United and they hired me. When I was hired, stewardesses could not be married. I thought it was wrong. Why can't you be married? Pilots can be married. Why is it okay for a pilot to be married and not a stewardess? I don't understand. What's the difference? I was secretly married for 4 years. We had observation reports called check rides, and you were evaluated on everything. I remember there was a supervisor who gave me a performance evaluation. She said one of my problems was that I just was tenacious. They wanted someone who complied. You did what you were told to do, and you didn't challenge them. I found it hard not to challenge them. When they started giving me extra check rides, I thought, they have to know I'm married and they're trying to get rid of me. I was off of work for 9 months. I really never wanted to be a housewife. I wanted to get back in the air. And then one day I said, "The hell with this." And I went to the Miami Herald. I said, "You want a funny story?"
This stewardess married secretly. Then when she admitted she was married, the airline fired her. She, the stewardess, said today, "They certainly have a funny set of morals."
When it hit the news, there was a group of stewardesses in Miami, and they all wore wedding bands to work. They kind of ganged up on the company. It hit the fan in the executive offices in Chicago. Fortunately, I had free legal services from my husband, and I filed a lawsuit.
Flight attendants are contesting age and marriage rules on a variety of airlines.
For the first couple of years, the judges who were hearing these sex discrimination cases really sided with the airlines, almost unilaterally.
Then there's a crucial court decision where the judges determined the essential work that an airline does is safely transport people from point A to point B. If that's the essential work of an airline, then the essential work of a flight attendant is about safety. It doesn't matter if you're a woman. It doesn't matter if you're under age 32. It doesn't matter if you're married.
We start to see a kind of consensus among courts, and they start to rule for flight attendants.
As it turned out, they had to give me all of my back pay, and they had to pay my lawyer's fees.
Flight attendants had achieved a lot in terms of gaining certain workplace rights, but there was a lot more to be done.
In the earlier days, aircraft were smaller, so therefore it was very important to have a weight limit. You have to filter in fuel, baggage, the weight of the passengers, and you also had to add in the stewardess's weight.
The girls who fly come in various sizes. The assortment is greater than most people think. They can be as tall as 5'9". One airline takes girls as short as 4'5".
They had a card, your appearance card, that weighed you in every month and put your weight down.
You would just get off a plane. A supervisor is waiting for you with a clipboard. There's a scale at the bottom of the stairs. And if you were even 1 pound over your hiring weight, you were put on probation. And you had 3 chances to lose that weight.
I took water pills. I took diet pills. I starved. Those were some of the tricks that all of us did. All of us did. We just passed the tricks around and said, here, take this laxative, you'll lose 3 pounds.
No, here, take this Dexedrine Spancel. You won't be hungry all day.
Just for 1 pound, you could be taken off a payroll.
No one else at the airline except women were being held to this standard. If you're thinking of it in terms of a system of bodily control, this is pretty extreme.
Airline executives had approached flight attendants for so long in such a patronizing way. Even though so much had changed around them, airline executives don't seem to want to evolve with the times.
When a Braniff International hostess meets you on the airplane, she'll be dressed like this.
Airlines had this stodgy, old-fashioned image that was dependable, reliable, but not hip or cool.
When she brings you your dinner, she'll be dressed this way.
Braniff hired Emilio Pucci to design stewardess uniforms.
The airstrip is brought to you by Braniff International, who believes that even an airline hostess should look like a girl.
This ad was not just appealing to male business travelers. It's appealing to women who want to be young and fashionable. This was really the beginning of an entirely new version of the stewardess.
Airlines start to go, how high can we go with these skirt lines?
Remember what it was like before Southwest Airlines? You didn't have hostesses and hot pants. Remember?
Prices were still fixed, so airlines wanted to get market share in any way that they could.
There was one uniform that was a problem because if you bent over, cleavage would show. We're going around keeping our hand on our chest.
TWA introduced foreign accent flights. They had 4 different designs for the uniforms, and they were all paper.
The paper dresses were either an old English wench, a French cocktail, an Italian toga, or the Manhattan penthouse. I was an old English wench. Maybe they wanted us to speak like Chaucer or something. I don't know. You had to kind of be careful, first of all, trying to get it on, that you didn't rip, which did happen sometimes. And you had to take off your other clothes in a tiny bathroom and then parade around in them. It was ridiculous.
I've got 747s to Miami. Fly me. I'm Terry. I've got great connections in Miami, all over the Sunshine States of America. Fly me.
I'm Marisa. I've got nonstop flights to Miami every day. Fly me.
Fly me. Fly me how? What are you going to do, get on top of me?
You can fly me morning, afternoon, or night. Just say when. I'm Judy, and I was born to fly. Fly me.
Fly Judy.
It was pretty close to me. And I hated that. It was really an insult.
It wasn't just that the ads were demeaning in some abstract way. It concretely affected the women's day-to-day lives. It made their job much harder.
We knew when people passed by us and felt our butts, or they accidentally pretended they were reaching for something to fill our breast, or trapped us, tried to squeeze past something so they could fill your body.
The pilots had a little habit, in particular, one of them I remember when I was going to my room at the layover, and he ran his hand down my back and he said, "Oh, I see you're a modern woman. You don't wear a bra."
Some women were busy enjoying their new freedoms which they felt very happy about, to exist as sexual beings in a world that was now willing to acknowledge them as such. But those campaigns in particular really did cause a much wider swath of the women who were working as stewardesses to stand up and say, hang on, that's one step too far.
Just as stewardesses are becoming more sexualized, the world is becoming more complicated. This is the darkest hour in America's Cold War fight.
We'd like to welcome you aboard Flying Tiger Line flight number F2B3 to Benoit, Vietnam.
By 1968, there are 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam at any given moment. To maintain those numbers, the U.S. military can't do it alone, so they contract with private airlines. The arrangement is that they're leasing the jet fully staffed.
Flying in, it was very somber. But the soldiers knew where they were going.
We usually landed in the middle of the night and got in and out of Vietnam as quickly as possible. Men off, men on. They were shooting rockets. And that would have been a good score if they could pull down a 747.
When we landed, if you heard gunshots, you had to evacuate the aircraft quickly. You ran to the bunkers. Every time we left going home, there's an absolute huge roar. Some of the soldiers got hooked on drugs. I remember one flight, someone had not been weaned off of whatever they were on, and he was just shaking all the way back. I just put my arms around him and held him until we got to where we were going, and they got medical transport for him.
The flight attendant profession has always struggled with the differences between the intensity and seriousness of the work that must be done, especially as safety professionals. And then you've got this public role of being desirable, of being serene, of being charming. The late 60s, early 70s is this very precarious and completely confused moment.
Stewardess! I think my window's open! It's not my aisle. They are so dumb. Beautiful, but dumb.
You're being marketed basically as a Barbie doll, and yet doing more and more complex work. There's a fundamental incompatibility between these two things.
The scene was an all too familiar one at LaGuardia Airport today, as an early afternoon bomb threat forced the evacuation of the airport.
In the late 60s, there were a lot of bomb threats. And once you get a bomb threat for an airplane, you evacuate it. And you don't get back on until they've cleared it. So we had a bomb threat, and we'd evacuated the airplane. The pilot comes out of the cockpit and says to me, "While we're here, would you mind cooking me a steak and make it medium rare?" Without even thinking, I went to the galley, I turned on the oven, and then all of a sudden it struck me, there I was in the galley of an aircraft that might explode at any minute, cooking this guy a steak. I had one of those clicks where, wait a minute, why would I be doing this? I walked off the airplane and I said, "You can cook your steak yourself. I'm not staying there." That moment was a turning point for me. The men don't have to wear hats with their uniform, why do we? The men don't have to wear girdles, why do we? The men got single rooms, the women did not. Once you open your eyes, you can never wholly close them again.
When I was 30 years old, I was the master executive chairman with the union, which entitled me to sign a non-discriminatory contract with Northwest Airlines. It included a provision for stewardesses to become pursers. The purser handled all of the paperwork on international flights. They did not have weight check. They were able to wear eyeglasses, and they always had single rooms. There was no reason why a female could not be a purser.
If you were a woman that wanted to make a career out of flying, your natural inclination would be to move to the purser position because of the better pay. But certain airlines, like Northwest, refused to hire women for the purser position.
In 1967, Northwest hired 5 men off the street to be pursers. I called the Director of Labor Relations and I said, the contract requires you to post these purser job positions to everyone, which he did. The men made the stewardess feel that they were not entitled to the job and they could not handle the job of purser. I realized as Master Executive Chairman that someone had to do it. So I applied for the job. I became the first and only female purser with Northwest Airlines. When I became a purser, I actually took a pay cut. The male pursers were getting $250 more per month. It was not fair at all. Why should I be treated differently than the men? My whole thought was, I am right and they are wrong. And as long as I am right, I will pursue this. Michael Gottesman was an expert in labor law. I made an appointment to see him.
Our expertise was labor law and employment law. We were the logical people to call.
I laid out the whole picture of the discrimination and how we had no recourse.
In the course of describing her efforts to get the purser job, she just said offhandedly, you know, it's particularly ridiculous because it's really the same job. If a man holds it, they call it a purser. If a woman holds it, they call it a stewardess. It would have been a good case, even if it was just the way they had treated Mary Pat. But it was a much bigger case. If they were paying 100 men a higher amount for doing the same work, then every female flight attendant would be entitled to the higher pay.
We filed a class action lawsuit on July 15th, 1970. We originally had 40 people to file the suit. That guaranteed us a class action.
You have to convince the judge that this would be an appropriate class action, that all of the people have the same grievance. And Mary Pat led the effort. She was fantastic at organizing.
We had to educate people that we were on the right side of the law, and we're only trying to force the company to obey the law.
Eastern presents The Losers.
She's awkward. Not very friendly. But she's too young. Oh, she bites nails. She wears glasses. Honey, no, the other, now.
Meet the Losers relishes the fact that they're turning away perfectly attractive, perfectly articulate people. And they're all white. And that is not an accident.
They're probably good enough to get a job anywhere they want. But at Eastern, we're very choosy about whom we let serve you on a plane.
Eastern Airlines, they're stressing we're still an exclusive form of transportation. And the promise of exclusivity is also a promise of racial exclusivity.
The first black flight attendant for Delta was hired in '66. And then I was hired in 1971. So we're saying nearly a decade after Pat won her case. Pat opened the doors, but the doors weren't kicked open, they were cracked.
By the start of the 1970s, there's about 1,000 black women working across all of the airlines. But that's only 3% of the total number of flight attendants in the country at that point. Affirmative action was designed to make sure that candidates of color, if they're qualified, they get hired. It replaces nepotism, where employers hire people that they're most comfortable with, which is usually people like themselves.
Airlines are forced to hire black people. It doesn't mean they want to.
I was hired in 1970. Once I completed the training and I started the job, I realized that the company, National Airlines, did not want me. When I would see certain captains, I knew scheduling was going to pull me off the flight because they refused to fly with me. When we traveled, you had to share a room. We would pull up to the hotel, the other 3 flight attendants. They've already discussed it among themselves. One would run out into the hotel and sign up for the rooms. By the time I'm getting into the hotel, they already have the key and they're gone. They would open the door, but then tell me that I have to go downstairs and get my own room. I remember the front desk not being able to convince them to open the door, not having any rooms available. And on many occasions, I would kind of settle in a corner, I'm still in uniform, and I would sleep in the lobby. There was absolutely no one that I could discuss a problem with. The union did not want me as well. If I had a problem with my own supervisor, who was I going to go to? I ended up calling the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I told them, I explained to them, and they asked me for proof, for paperwork or whatever, and I said they won't give it to me. And they said, well, we'll make a few phone calls. I have no idea what was said. I have no idea if they in fact made those calls. But all of a sudden, things started to change. My supervisor called me in and said, the director is asking, to submit names for the Fly Me ad. And I thought about it. Okay, you don't want me here? Watch this. You don't like me in the workforce? Then how are you gonna like me with my picture pasted all over? The sexual nature of the campaign ad, Fly Me, really didn't bother me. I did the ad because I wanted to show them.
When you looked at all the different advertisements, you never saw a black face. You never were chosen to do any advertisement. So the sexism was secondary. I'm not sitting here in a sexy position to advertise sex. You were representing the Black stewardess and all that we could accomplish and that we were capable of doing. We understand the burden of the doors that we possibly could be opening up for anyone else to follow us.
Take your hands so that you've got them up out of the water. Push the water away.
A couple of times a year, we used to go to recurrent training, and this person stopped and said, there is a huge billboard with your ad, the Fly Me ad. And when I saw you, I thought, I didn't know they had Black stewardesses, and she went and applied.
Women's Rights Day, come join us in the march tomorrow. Join us, rally out.
For more than 4 years, members of the National Organization for Women have been campaigning throughout the nation for more equality and better civil rights. And today their movement is wider and stronger than ever.
This inhuman system of exploitation will change, but only if we force it to change, and force it together.
I've never been captive.
No, I don't feel enslaved or anything
we
like that.
We love you, man, and you can be the boss.
Women's liberation, now!
Equality, you don't know what the hell you want.
On this strike to confront the unfinished business of our equality.
I'm a very happy housewife and a very happy mother.
Go do the dishes! Go do the dishes! Go do the dishes!
We're not going to be able to do anything unless we begin to do it for ourselves.
heard about it. Thank you. Yes. Good.
Women's liberation has reared its pretty head in the friendly skies.
Leaflets for our first national convention.
These women are protesting what strikes them as sexual discrimination on the airlines. The question is whether or not a stewardess is a flying waitress, a sex object, or a safety expert. They seem to be a little bit of all three, but some of them are so annoyed by that sex object business that they formed an organization to try and change their image.
I would like you to know that I am trained to open this door in case of emergency, to take care of an epileptic attack, take care of a heart attack. If you should have one, I am there to help you with these things. And also, if none of these things should happen on your flight, I will serve you a meal and offer you a cocktail. If I were thinking...
In 1972, a group of women founded Stewardesses for Women's Rights, and they were really trying to find a place in the broader women's movement for stewardesses who were invested in political change as well as workplace change.
They wanted to professionalize the occupation, raise the status and respect of the job. They also wanted to make the airplane safer, not just for the women who worked there and for the employees, but also for the passengers.
There's really nothing wrong with being a stewardess. What's wrong is the image that has been portrayed to the public, that we are empty-headed little fluffs that serve you a meal and take care of anything that you want taken care of on the airplane without a complaint. In fact, that we're not people.
They took up economic issues like promoting women into positions that they had been excluded from, but they also focused on issues that had not been seen as labor issues, issues having to do with appearance and grooming and control over women's bodies.
I find it depletes me. I get so angry. Certain things can set me off and I get in an irrational rage and I have to hold it back.
I joined because I've had a lot of frustrations, and I felt that the union was not the answer to a lot of this stuff. The union reps were just a bunch of 50, 60-year-old guys that were oblivious to the advertising and to the sex discrimination. I just don't think they were capable of understanding it or something. You know, it was like we're dealing with people who were in a different generation.
I don't think that a lot of feminists thought that these stewardesses, who on the surface looked so complacent, could be so effective.
I think the experience of standing up and speaking out for one's rights and the rights of others is a contagious one, and it's one that really does make waves and change lives. It's like throwing a pebble into a pond. The waves of reaction continue for a very long time.
Gloria Steinem championed stewardesses' rights from the beginning.
Gloria was so supportive. She used to come to the offices. She felt that flight attendants would make a good case for changes that women were going through. We could represent a new era. She just had a lot of positive energy, like, we can do this. We can just, fight them.
Stewardesses for Women's Rights were savvy in terms of fighting fire with fire. They distributed bumper stickers and buttons, and the buttons said, "Go fly yourself." The bumper sticker said, "National, your fly is open." And one of the things they did,
may I have your attention, please?
was what they called a counter commercial.
I don't think of myself as a sex object or a servant, but as someone who is capable of opening the door of a 747 in the dark, upside down, and in the water. Fantasies are fine in their place, but let's be honest. The sexpot stewardess image is unsafe at any altitude. Think about it.
We went to trial on December 4th, 1972. 70% of Northwest Airlines stewardesses were part of the lawsuit. It was a 6-week trial. Executives of Northwest Airlines had to testify.
We were the plaintiffs, so we had to put our case on first.
Northwest tried to make a point that for safety reasons, they thought that women would want to share rooms, whereas men, they felt quite safe staying in their own room.
Why do you put women in double rooms and allow men to have single rooms?
The company's witness said, in restaurants, you see women going to the bathroom together. They don't go to the ladies' room alone.
That was their explanation, that this is what women want.
The whole staff in the court were like, oh, what kind of logic is that?
And I remember the judge's reaction. He just leaned back in his seat and roared. And he was looking up and he was laughing.
A federal judge today ordered Northwest Airlines to do the following things: pay back salary and interest to all stewardesses who were fired since 1965 for being overweight, give stewardesses paid less than stewards since 1968 the difference in salary, and reimburse stewardesses for the difference in room rent since 1968 when they doubled up while stewards had single rooms.
The judge made the decision in our favor on all issues. But then Northwest Airlines was able to appeal the case.
Their strategy was to take every opportunity that was legally available to them to defer the final moment when they were going to have to pay this money out. It took 11 years.
My sister was folding her laundry and she called me and said, Patty, you won. I said, what?
The Supreme Court today upheld the big payoff awarded to stewardesses who sued Northwest Airlines for sex discrimination. The women charged that they were paid...
There is justice. That was my thinking. There is justice.
It was a big win. $60 million is a big chunk of money. And for a flight attendant to be receiving in one fell swoop $50,000 in back pay.
Women could wear eyeglasses. They would no longer be suspended for weight. And we could have single rooms. One flight attendant sent a note and said that every time she walks around in her single room, naked, she thinks of me.
Mary Pat Laffey's victory is definitive in saying that under no circumstances shall a woman doing this job be presented with different and unequal standards as a man doing this job. This is what women's workplace civil rights are designed to do.
The Mary Pat Laffey case encouraged flight attendants to push the boundaries and to move into those jobs that had been off limits.
The women were finally allowed to have the same benefits that the men had. If you were capable, you could have a man's job.
Now, a flight attendant can be male, can be older, can be married, can be any race, ethnic origin. We're different now. We kind of match the passengers.
We weren't fighting for ourselves. That's what made it so wonderful. I wasn't fighting for me. I was fighting for the girl next to me.
Next time.
The sun's energy is absorbed and transformed into heat.
Maria Telka was a solar evangelist.
She really imagined this as revolutionizing the way that people lived.
Nothing else would even get close to the Dover Sun House.
She's laying a foundation for pretty much everything now that we do with solar.
The Sun Queen, next time on American Experience. Made possible in part by Liberty Mutual Insurance.